So a number of viewers have asked, what are our RIO's responsibilities? And I think the best way for me to answer that is to kind of go over the high points of my career and build the picture along the way. So I was influenced to become involved in naval aviation because of my father, who was a career Marine Corps attack pilot. He flew A4s when he was a junior officer and served in Vietnam in 66 and 67, flying the A4 with VMA 121, the Green Knights. And then later, when I was in high school, he was the CEO of the same squadron, except now they were flying the A6E Intruder. So because of some of the folks in his command who were Naval Academy grads, I decided that's where I wanted to go to college. And I made it there eventually. I had to go to prep school for a year, but showed up the summer of 1978. Here's a picture of the class of 82 on induction day, July 6th, 1978 to be exact. I'm in this picture somewhere. And, wound up being a midshipman for 4 years. I enjoyed being a mid mostly. Academics were tough. I was a poli-sci major, but as I describe in the West Point cheating scandal episode, regardless of your major, you're focused on engineering, the engineering disciplines, because as Hyman Rickover directed, every midshipman is going into a very technical U.S. Navy or Marine Corps. So, now, meanwhile, you're trying to decide what warfare specialty you want to go into. Do you want to be a submariner? Do you want to be a Marine ground, Marine aviation, surface warfare, or do you want to be a pilot, Navy pilot? So because of my father, I was thinking I either want to be a Marine Corps pilot or a Navy pilot. Now, sometime during my junior year, I noticed that my left eye was getting bad. And so reluctantly, I went to one of the doctors there and he gave me an eye exam. And I'll never forget it. He turned to me and said, well, you're not going to be a pilot. So my service selection matrix changed significantly at that point, in that pilot, Marine Corps or Navy, was now off the table. So I had to decide, basically, did I want to be an NFO or did I want to be a surface warfare? I knew I didn't want to be a Marine ground guy, and nuke power was not really in the cards for me because my grades weren't good enough and I wasn't invited to interview for nuke power. So fortunately, when I was a senior, or actually what's called your first class cruise, I went out to Hawaii and had the opportunity to fly in the backseat of a Marine Corps F-4J. And I fell in love with it right at that moment. I mean, as soon as I strapped in, put the O2 on, had the G suit, we launched, did a 1v1 against another F4, went supersonic, came into the break. I was just in love with every aspect of it. I also sort of found myself among the aviators of VMFA 235 there at Kaneohe, never mind that they were Marines. And so I decided I'm going to go NFO with an eye on getting RIO as the community that I would select once I got my wings. So I was thinking maybe I would pick Marine Corps NFO, and you can go to the basic school, which is primary training for fresh caught second lieutenants down at Quantico. But they only had 10 Marine NFO billets because the Marine Corps was getting rid of the F4 and getting the one-seat Hornet at that time. And so those 10 billets went really quickly, and I was lower half of my class because of my grades. And so I wound up selecting Navy NFO. So go down to Pensacola after graduation and do the aviation indoc, which is basically some academics, the swim physiology stuff, including the dunker, like an officer and a gentleman, and a survival school. And then you show up at basic NFO training at Pensacola at Sherman Field, which is the main side airfield, at VT-10, the Cosmic Cats. Now, VT-10 at that time was structured so you had 4 months of ground school before you saw an airplane. And they also tell you that every grade matters. Every test matters towards your class standing. And the only person who gets what he or she wants is the number one person in each class. So we all took a strain because we wanted to get our first choice. In fact, if I had studied as hard at the Naval Academy as I did in flight school, I would have been in the top 100 of my class for sure. But I didn't. But the thing about being in flight training is you just love the environment. This is what you selected, and you want to know everything about everything. So it's not hard to apply yourself. In those days, our first 5 flights were in the T-2 Buckeye, which was a jet. So we didn't start in a prop plane. We jumped right into a jet, which was pretty daunting. Your G-suit, oxygen mask, strapping into an ejection seat, clamshell, bubble canopy, and you were thrown into the deep end. So right from the first flight, you're B1, you were talking on the radio, you're doing all the navigation, you were calling the acrobatic maneuvers that you did, and the mission of the instructors unofficially on B1 was to try to get you sick. And so in the early days of ground school, instructors would ask, who wants to go F-14? Or who wants to go RIO? Because at this time you could go F-4 or F-14. And literally 3/4 of the class would raise their hands. And then the other choice, although there were other options, but the other choice was who wants to go P-3 or Orion land-based? And about 25% of the class would raise their hand. Now, after the basic syllabus, the first 5 flights in the jet, they asked that question again. And now the ratio, the percentages were inverted in that only 25% of the class wanted to go RIO, and the other 75% wanted to go P-3, because that 75% was not comfortable in the airplane. They were good on the ground, but once they actually felt the G and had the O2 mask on and the pressure was on because the instructor was asking them questions, so they got to talk on the radio and figure out where the airplane is navigation-wise, all of that, they just didn't adapt. So that was good for those of us who wanted to go RIO because there were only a finite amount of billets. So pipeline selection comes after the basic part of VT10. And as I said, the number one person gets what he or she wants. I was number 3. Number 1 guy picks F-14. Fortunately, number 2 person picked P-3s. So number 3, I picked RIO. And so we go RIO pipeline over to the advanced squadron, which is VT-86, still located at NAS Pensacola. So the first thing you learn at VT-86 is how to run an intercept. So this is the RIO's primary responsibility when you're first learning how to be a RIO. And so you would learn about the trigonometry, because it's 3-dimensional, of running an intercept. And you'd learn how to read a radar screen and how to maneuver an airplane to affect a rendezvous or whatever it is you wanted to do. So we would fly the T-39 Saberliner, and in the back of these airplanes they had 4 radar stations. They were basically old F-8 radars, and it was a tough system to run an intercept on. Basically, you'd have to figure out which bit of fuzz on this screen was moving against the static and deal with that. So you would start by running what we call a re-attack, which is manage the drift of the contact as it's marching closer and closer. So you'd basically put it on the screen where you need it and figure out target aspect and direct the pilot, who was in the front of the T-39. These guys were actually retired military aviators who were contract pilots for Grumman, for Northrop, now Northrop Grumman. And you'd rendezvous, and he'd say about halfway through the rendezvous turn, I got a tally, and so then he would take over and affect the rendezvous. So you were running intercepts against another T-39 with 3 or 4 students in it. Ground control was happening on the ground. You had a GCI controller. And these scenarios would get harder and harder as the syllabus ramped up. So you basically, by the time you finished the intercept phase of RIO training, you were pretty good at running intercepts on a radar. Now, the last 5 flights of the RIO training syllabus before you were awarded your wings were in the TA-4J. And this is important because you had to prove that you also could be a good co-pilot. So these flights were very dynamic, high G, a lot of pressure, and they were designed to have the RIO flight student call the fight. So let me break out our training aids here. And so you'd have basically 3 scenarios: neutral setups, offensive setups where you're this guy, and defensive setups where you're this guy. And so the pilots, the instructor pilots, would act basically as voice-activated pilots. And so the RIO student would call everything. So let's imagine that we're in this airplane and it's a defensive scenario. So fight's on, this guy rolls in, and now you've got to get to a neutral position. And so you've got to keep sight. TA-4 cockpit is very small, by the way, very narrow canopy rails. And so you've got to torque around and direct the pilot what to do. So let's say we would go, okay, brake left, stop, roll, pull. And now you're keeping sight of this guy as he's rolling in on him. You want to drive the thing neutral. And if you still got an advantage, you got to keep talking to the pilot. Like, he's across the circle, he's coming nose on. Do you see him? No, I don't see him. Keep the calls coming. Okay, keep the pull coming. Roll left, stop, roll, pull harder. Do you see him? No. Okay, we just merged. Roll right, pull. You know, you call the entire fight. And so this is high pressure flying. And the thing that's important is this shows RIOs the other part of their responsibilities. These things live in parallel. You're a weapons system operator, and you're a co-pilot in all flight regimes. So keep that in mind as we're talking about RIO responsibilities. So, in fact, some of my classmates did not do well in the last 5 TA-4 flights, and they went to a board, and in one case, this guy didn't get his wings. So that shows you how much emphasis that naval aviation training puts on RIOs being able to fly the airplane with descriptive and directive comms. Okay, co-pilot duties, not just a weapon system operator. So the other thing that you learn is directive comms, flying the airplane from the back seat. So it's not just do some of that pilot shit, Maverick. It's like if Viper's rolling in on you and Maverick's like, I don't see him. Goose directs Maverick where to fly the airplane until he fills the windscreen with Bandit. And Maverick's like, oh, I got him. Fox 2 or guns or whatever. So, got my wings, October of '83. NFO wings, 2 crossed anchors, different from pilot wings with a single vertical anchor. And a few months later, showed up at NAS Oceana in Virginia Beach, Virginia, as a Cat 1 RIO flight student in the F-14 training squadron. So I'll never forget the first time I walked into the hangar there at Oceana and saw the F-14. I felt a sense of belonging and commitment. At that moment, it was forged in me that I wanted to know everything about this airplane and being a RIO and being involved in carrier aviation. It just sort of, it's like resonant software that came alive. So what you noticed from the first lecture you got there was the instructors, who are all-stars from the community. It's hard to be a RAG instructor. And RAG is an acronym for Replacement Air Group, which is a dated acronym. Technically, it's called Fleet Replacement Squadron, but you can't say FIRS. It's easier to say RAG. So RAG instructors were the best the community had to offer. And whether it was a pilot instructor or a RIO instructor, they addressed us as a single entity. Now, of course, there were some pilot simulators and pilot learnings and RIO simulators and RIO learnings, but there was this sense of unity, and they would say it straight out, that this airplane cannot function without great pilots and great RIOs. You cannot operate an F-14 to its full potential without both. So that was the attitude we took. And so the phases of VF-101 starts with basic phase, where you just learn about the weapon system, the various radar modes, track while scan, pulse Doppler, pulse. You learn how to run intercepts, 1v1, then 2v2, and just basic intercept kind of stuff. And then you do a gun syllabus, which is primarily a pilot thing, but there's a RIO responsibility as well in terms of keeping track of airspeed. There's a radar mode where you can lock the radar so the pilot gets the HUD presentation that's more accurate. And that was a lot of fun. That was really a dynamic series of flights, doing the guns pattern there, shooting a banner that was being towed by an A4. Then you go on to tactics phase. Now, tactics is the gunfighting ACM phase. This is your dogfighting phase. And so that was super fun. And again, it's a 1v1, 2v2, many v many. RIOs, they'd be like 40-mile setups, so the RIOs are calling the intercept and sorting and figuring out, and then it transitions to pilots get tallies, and now as the merge happens, now it's co-pilot, pilot. So if the pilot loses sight, or if the pilot has sight, if he sees this guy, then I'm looking back here trying to find somebody else. And I'm assessing the threat, right? So again, if this bandit is not nose on and my pilot's prosecuting somebody else, I'm not going to immediately call him off the airplane he's prosecuting. I'm going to go, okay, he's not nose on, keep pressing. Okay, he's pulling nose on, brake left. That's what the RIO would do in that scenario. And then we did advanced phase. So advanced phase is the sort of Soviet threat, jammers, long-range missiles, got to recognize different types of jamming, that kind of thing. The last thing that I did was I was also given the TARP syllabus, which is the Tactical Air Reconnaissance Pod System. And that's the photopod, and I'll talk about this in detail in another episode, as some have requested. But that was a 10-flight syllabus that I did at the very end because I was selected to go right on deployment. I was top scope in my class, which I was very proud of because, as I mentioned, in my class were 7 Naval Academy graduate RIOs, all classmates. So I was first among them and went right on deployment on the USS Independence as a member of VF-32. So I walk aboard the ship there in Norfolk, and we put to sea, and we start doing flight ops. So I was flying with the XO, later the CO, who was my pilot. So junior RIO flying with a senior pilot. I had never had a cat shot or a trap. Now, some of my classmates had, because while we were at the RAG, sometimes senior pilots would be coming through the RAG on their way to a fleet squadron and they need a quick refresher. It included carrier quals. But they wouldn't let student fly with student to do carrier quals. So I didn't fly with my peers in my RAG class. Some of my classmates got to fly with the senior guys. I did not. So the first time I saw the ship was when I was in my first fleet squadron. And so the XO, we go into flight deck control, and he's literally like, hang on to the back of my LPU, his flight preserver thing, and we'll walk out there. And so we hot switched into an airplane that had already done some cats and traps getting qualled. So they sideline an airplane, shut down the left engine. I get into the back seat. XO gets in the front seat, taxi to the catapult. Now, my responsibilities are twofold at this point. roger the wakeboard, and I refer to the Secrets of F-14 Tomcat Carrier Ops episode for the details, but I'm rogering the wakeboard, verifying our weight, and then cat shot, which I cannot describe how eye-opening my first cat shot was. And I was just like, how do student pilots do this and maintain control of the airplane when they have their first cat shot? Because my brain was left behind, going from 0 to 150 knots in 2.2 seconds. It was a rush. So airborne, we didn't even raise the gear. We just turned downwind, come around, and now it's my responsibility to call the ball. So, first ball call, it's kind of nerve-wracking. Gypsy 201 Tomcat ball 5.3. Roger ball, Tomcat, you're high. Trap. So I look over at the maintenance guys, up and up, go right to the cat. We do this half a dozen times. So that was my first exposure to cats and traps. And so as a first tour RIO, you're flying with senior pilots. They're showing you the ropes. They're showing you how to do cyclic ops, regular operations. We did some cool exercises in the Mediterranean. This cruise took place first in the Mediterranean, then we went through the Suez Canal. I had my first of 8 trips through the Suez Canal. And we wound up doing some really fun flying in Oman against the Omani Air Force, which were actually British mercenary pilots, and amazing landscape there. So we got to do some really cool dissimilar air combat against Hawkers and Jaguars, or Hunters and Jaguars. They're the 2 types of airplanes. And then I did my first real-world intercept against an Iranian P-3, which was wild, escorting the P-3, and then also against a Russian AN-22. And so the trick was keep your airplane between the Russian or the bad guy and the ship. So any pictures they take as they overfly the ship have a Tomcat in them. And also we had these Brownie, wet film cameras, these little Polaroid camera, not Polaroid, but Nikon cameras, and we would take a bunch of intel pictures. And so I learned the art of debriefing the intelligence guys. And they would ask questions, and they'd download your pictures and say, oh, you did this right, you did this wrong. So again, the full extent of RIO responsibilities were starting to unfold. Be good at operating the radar, be good at directing an intercept, be good at collecting intelligence. The other thing that I learned from our maintenance guys, the master chiefs and the chiefs, was how to write a good maintenance action form, a MAF. So you'd come back after a flight and you'd write a MAF. And if it was not detailed enough, they'd give it back to you and go, sir, I cannot fix the airplane based on this description. So you get smarter. You become a fleet aviator, not just a student aviator. By the time I got back from my first deployment, I knew a lot more than I did before that deployment. The other thing that happened the first summer back from that first deployment is we worked with Top Gun doing a thing that was called Fleet Fighter Air Readiness Program, FARP. And so I met a lot of the all-stars who, if you look at the credits for Top Gun, you can see their names: Hollywood Dishart, Jaws Winnefeld, and Bio Baranek. So some of you may know Bio. He's written a couple of great books, Top Gun Days, and he has a new one out. And Bio was very influential to me as a RIO in terms of how to be a best ever RIO. Now, on my second cruise, we cross-decked from Indy and CAG 6 to the John F. Kennedy and CAG 3. And so this was the first time, as now I am a more senior first tour RIO, that I flew with a junior pilot. Now it's my job to show a first tour pilot some of the ropes of how we do cyclic ops and bilateral operations and different things that we would do on deployment. Now this deployment was all Mediterranean. We did not go through the Suez, but we did exercises against other NATO countries and some stuff over in the Eastern Med as well. Now after that deployment, I did, which is truly a milestone for a RIO, which is I fired my first Phoenix during a missile exercise down in the Puerto Rican op area. So by this time I was the RIO training officer. I actually organized and planned this missile X and actually fired my first Phoenix, which was against a pod that was jamming. Now, in preps for this, I also had to go to Point Mugu in California at the Pacific Missile Test Center, PMTC, and look at this jamming on a real simulator with a real drone coming at us so I could recognize it when I did the missile X. So when you see that launch button light up because you've met the hot trigger logic and you fire that Phoenix, the other thing about a Phoenix is it had a 3-second LTE, launch to eject. So you'd say Fox 3, push that button, be 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, clunk, and then it came off. And that was a lifetime. So finished that tour in VF 32, went to be, now I'm a RIO instructor at VT 86, which again, I'm now teaching the next generation of RIOs how to run intercepts. But the other thing I got to do that really made me a better RIO as my career went on, again, 2 things in parallel, weapon system operator, co-pilot, was I got to fly a lot of TA4 time, because if they had an empty back seat during the student syllabus, fellow instructor RIOs could jump in it. And so a friend of mine who's a Tomcat pilot, Ted Morse, call sign Tweed, would take me up and give me a lot of stick time and show me how to fight the A4, including getting the nose stuck up here, pull the throttle back to idle, let it come over, then put the power back on, how to manage the slats. So the slats on the A4 are aerodynamic driven. There's no mechanical control. The pilot does not control whether they're up or down. So he'd tell me about how to use those slats to make a better turn rate or keep them up, that sort of thing. So I was able to really learn beyond what I knew from being a co-pilot in my first squadron about calling a fight, take it to the next level. So after that, I went to a different short tour. I was the editor of Approach Magazine. I was flying with the aggressor squadron at Oceana. And again, a lot of backseat stick time in F5F, F-16, TA4. And pilots very much enjoyed teaching a guest player in the backseat how to fight the airplane. So I got smart on how to do that actually with hands on the stick. And I'll address some of those techniques and some of the ways that you approach basic dogfighting in a separate episode. After that tour, I was lucky enough to get orders back to another Tomcat squadron as what we call a Super JO. So now I'm in VF 143, the Puking Dogs, with brand new F-14. They were called A pluses and then Bs. These things were fresh from Grumman. And I'm cruising now in CAG 7 aboard my first nuke boat, which was the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. And so we cruised to the Mediterranean, went through the ditch again, and then went straight to the Gulf. We're the first carrier on the scene after the hostilities phase of Desert Storm. So the oil fires are still burning, and the destruction is still there. This is the first time I hit a heavy tanker. So if you look at the in-flight refueling episode, I described that in great detail. But now I'm flying again with junior pilots, including some names that you would recognize, like Scott Kelly, the astronaut. And Scott Kelly talks about one flight we had where there was a sandstorm approaching as we were trying to land on the ship in the Gulf in his book Endurance. So a great tour. Spent some time in the Gulf. This is before Operation Southern Watch existed. Come back through the ditch, go through the Med, and now we're told you guys also have another operation exercise that's tacked onto the end of your cruise. So don't come home, turn right once you pass the Rock of Gibraltar. And so we went to the North Atlantic. This is the hairiest flying I've ever done. Iceland, UK gap type of stuff, rough seas, Shetland Islands, up there above the Arctic Circle. So I'm flying with a guy named Grinch Brophy on one particular flight. Our air wing LSO is a name you might recognize, Kevin Hoser Miller, who's the author of the Raven series. So I know some of you are familiar with Hoser, but he literally saved our lives that day. So he's working the ball in what's called moveless, because the automatic lens cannot keep up if the ship is pitching a lot, and it was pitching a lot. Coming downhill, Grinch was seriously, at task saturation in this heavy seas, high winds. So I definitely had to use co-pilot skills to keep him cool and to stay aware of where the recovery tanker was and what our options were if we couldn't get aboard. Hoser was giving us these great calls using Movless. 3 passes, we finally got aboard. At one point, Grinch, as he's listening to Hoser says a little power, and Grinch puts a burst of power on, and Hoser says, easy with it. And we wound up boltering, hit the S3 tanker, 500 pounds, came back around. And in the debrief, I asked Grinch, what happened with that burst of power? Why did you come on so strong? He goes, I saw the screws of the ship. The stern came out of the water so far that you could see the propellers of this aircraft carrier. That gives you an indication of just how rough it was. So that was another great tour. The thing that got better is I wound up going from that tour to be a RAG instructor. So now, as a RAG instructor, I'm now, like my early influencers, I'm one of those guys who's influencing the next generation of Tomcat crews. I'm now part of the all-star team. And so in this role, you got to be really smart on the latest and greatest software upgrades and ways to use the backseat to good effect. And then you also have to be completely now, because you have fresh winged pilots who've never been in the F-14, and you're doing their first flights with them. So again, that made me a much better RIO in all the ways that I needed to be. The other thing that was happening in the community is now the F-14, because the A6 has gone away, is starting to do bombing, starting with conventional bombing. So we're starting to learn about the symbology in the HUD and what the backseat switchology was associated with dropping Mark 80 series dumb bombs. So I was able to go to my department head tour in a squadron I wanted, VF-102, the Diamondbacks, aboard the USS America, and went on deployment. We thought it was going to be a peacetime cruise, but it wound up being a wartime cruise, and we were fighting the Bosnian War of 1995, trying to get the Serbs to break the siege of Sarajevo. So now I am the operations officer for VF-102. And that was a super high op-tempo deployment. We broke all records associated with the number of flight hours and number of sorties. We did go to the Gulf for a little bit, flying Operation Southern Watch. That was my first exposure to Operation Southern Watch, the patrolling of the no-fly zone. We were on the night page when we were there, meaning we would fly from 12 midnight to 12 noon, while the Air Force would fly from 12 noon to 12 midnight. And so that was kind of an eye-opener. And then we got called to come back to the Gulf because there was some other goings-on in the Adriatic that we had to deal with. That was a very rewarding tour. Now, I was asked to stay in the Air Wing to become the Air Wing Ops Officer. And that was something I jumped at the opportunity because that was, I would keep flying, but it would be a smart career move. And so we wound up, this Air Wing left America. America was decommissioned. She's now at the bottom of the Atlantic, unfortunately, which breaks my heart. And we transferred to cross-deck to the USS George Washington, a newer nuclear boat, which I'd actually done the shakedown when I was in VF-143 back in the early 90s. So now it's 97, 98 time frame. And we're in the Med, and we get sorted to go back to the Gulf. So again, Operation Southern Watch. And I got to do a lot of strike planning. Now we have the Lantern Pod. And so the backseat is a completely different configuration. Now we have the programmable TID, and we're able to do precision strike capability. So the RIO responsibilities now become even greater in that the RIO is the one controlling the pod, and also is responsibility for some of the switchology in order that you can drop a bomb. So crew coordination is now just an air-to-air, not just an air-to-air thing, it's also an air-to-ground thing. And again, as the airplane matured, a lot of stuff was placed in the back seat. So basically, I've said that there were two principal responsibilities of the RIO: weapon system operator in a dynamic environment and co-pilot in all flight regimes. But there's really four things to think about. So those two, and then also you're a mission planner and a strike leader. And so that's flight prep. Get in civic. So for every 2 hours of a flight, there's literally 6 hours of planning and then another 2 hours of debriefing. So if you're flying 2 or 3 times a day, you can see this starts to be a very long day. And nobody's going to say, hey, you're a RIO, so you should do this kind of planning. There's no differentiation. You're a strike planner. And so you've got to take a strain. You've got to know everything about everything. And then the other thing over everything is you're a leader. You're a naval officer, leader of your peers and sailors. And that is actually the most rewarding part about having a career in naval aviation. All right, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you for subscribing, for commenting, for the thumbs up. If you're a first-time viewer, please ring the bell. Join the community. Please share this episode on your other social networks. Thanks for the support. We're growing fast. We're transonic here in terms of the channel growth, and I very much appreciate that. And I'll talk to you again soon.